The smell of raw mahogany and linseed oil was the only companion I had ever truly needed, a scent that filled my workshop in the quiet, mist-covered hills of the Dandenong Ranges. For 3 months, my world had narrowed to the physical intimacy of this space, where the rough edge of a salvaged timber board became a geometry problem waiting to be solved. I ran my callous thumb along the edge of the executive desk I was crafting. It was a heavy, traditional piece built from a majestic mahogany tree I had procured over a decade ago. Every dovetail joint was cut by hand, every surface sanded until the grain revealed a depth that mass-produced furniture could never replicate. I was crafting this specifically for my grandson, Cameron. He had recently completed his degree in architecture at the University of Melbourne, finishing at the top of his class with a singular focus that I found deeply admirable. I wanted his professional journey to begin with something solid, a piece of furniture built with intention, durability, and a respect for the craft that seemed increasingly rare in our modern, disposable world. The physical labor, the planing, the measuring, the endless hours of sanding had made my shoulders ache with a persistent, dull throb. Yet it was a good kind of pain. It was the pain of providing, of creating something that would outlast the fleeting trends of the day. I wiped the fine mahogany sawdust from my hands with a weathered rag and checked my heavy steel wristwatch. It was Thursday morning. The graduation ceremony at the Melbourne Cricket Ground had taken place 2 weeks prior, a grand affair where I had watched Cameron walk across the stage, his silhouette crisp against the stadium lights. My son, Lachlan, had casually mentioned that they were organizing a small, private dinner for Cameron, a gathering to honor his hard work. I had been waiting for the exact details, holding the invitation in the quiet space of my own anticipation. I picked up my mobile phone from the workbench. The glass screen was smeared with a light coating of wood dust. I wiped it clean against my trousers and pressed the speed dial for Lachlan. I listened to the rhythmic, ringing 1, 2, 3, as I looked at the polished brass handles I still needed to install on the desk drawers. I had intended to ask Lachlan if I should bring my signature slow-smoked brisket to the dinner or if they had already engaged a catering firm. Finally, the ringing ceased. The line connected. I spoke, my voice steady, asking Lachlan what time I should head down to their residence in Brighton on Sunday. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the line. In the background, I could hear the faint, muffled sound of jazz music and the refined clinking of expensive crystal glassware, the unmistakable acoustic signature of a gathering already in progress. Lachlan cleared his throat, his voice shifting in a way that suggested he was suddenly preoccupied with something far more pressing than his father's inquiry. He stumbled over his words, muttering something incoherent about shifting schedules and an unfortunate misunderstanding. Then, the auditory texture of the call altered. A sharp rustling indicated that the phone had been violently snatched from his hand. Chloe, my daughter-in-law, spoke. Her voice was dripping with a toxic blend of amusement and absolute condescension. She did not bother to offer an excuse or a polite, fabricated lie. She informed me directly that the celebration had taken place at the Royal Brighton Yacht Club the previous Sunday. I stood frozen in the center of my workshop, the silence of the room suddenly feeling heavy with the realization of a profound, calculated betrayal. The rag slipped from my hand and hit the floor, landing silently in the dust. I was a man who had built structures meant to last centuries, yet I was entirely unprepared for the deliberate dismantling of my own family. Chloe's voice continued, conversational yet laced with a venomous clarity that pierced through the quiet of my Dandenong workshop. She explained, with the detachment of someone discussing a minor logistical inconvenience, that the event at the Royal Brighton Yacht Club had been an elite networking opportunity. They had curated a guest list of influential venture capitalists and high-end property developers from across Melbourne. She stated, without a hint of remorse, that my presence would have been an unnecessary complication, a social liability. Her words were precise. My calloused hands, my faded flannel shirts, and the utilitarian, dust-covered utility vehicle I parked in my driveway did not align with the pristine, curated aesthetic they were projecting to their investors. She argued that I would have disrupted the image of success and seamless affluence they were cultivating to secure their future. Before I could process the sheer cruelty inherent in her justification, I heard the distinct, sharp click of the call disconnecting. The dial tone buzzed in my ear, a flat, mechanical sound that replaced the voice of my own son and the woman who had once sat at my dinner table. I did not throw the phone in a fit of rage, nor did I shout at the rafters of my workshop. I simply placed the device gently onto the workbench, right beside a set of precision chisels. I looked at the unfinished mahogany desk, the wood grain glowing with a natural, honest warmth that stood in stark contrast to the hollow coldness of the conversation I had just endured. The silence of the workshop had shifted. It was no longer the peaceful solitude of a craftsman, but the heavy, leaden silence of a man facing the wreckage of his own paternal history. I walked out of the shop and climbed into my reliable utility vehicle. The engine roared to life, a steady, mechanical heartbeat that grounded me in the reality of my own labor. I drove away from the rolling, mist-drenched hills of the Dandenong Ranges and headed directly toward the affluent, coastal suburb of Brighton. The 40-minute drive was a transition between two different versions of the world. The one I had built with decades of grueling, consistent effort, and the one Lachlan and Chloe were currently performing. When I arrived in their neighborhood, I parked 2 blocks away, out of sight from the manicured hedges that lined their estate. I walked along the quiet, tree-lined footpath until I had a clear, unobstructed view of their massive, modern residence. The visual confirmation was staggering. 3 large commercial rental trucks were idling in their circular driveway, and a crew of event contractors was actively dismantling a sprawling, luxury white marquee that had covered their entire rear garden. I watched as men in professional attire carried out crystal chandeliers, towering floral arrangements, and velvet lounge furniture. This was not a modest family gathering that I had simply been forgotten in. This was a calculated, highly financed production. They had deliberately excluded me from the celebration of my only grandson's achievement because they viewed my working-class identity as a liability to their social climbing. I stood on the footpath, processing the scale of their deception. I felt no urge to march up to their front door and demand an explanation. A confrontation would have been a squandering of energy, serving only to satisfy their desire to label me as emotional or unreasonable. The disrespect was absolute, and I understood then that it required an equally absolute response. I turned away from the estate and walked back to my vehicle, my heart rate steady and my mind clearing with the cold, surgical precision of a structural engineer identifying the exact point where a foundation had begun to crumble. I drove back from Brighton in a state of controlled silence, the familiar winding roads of the Dandenong Ranges feeling like the veins of a life I had spent decades carefully constructing. I bypassed my workshop entirely, moving past the scent of fresh timber and into the quiet, cool interior of my home. The house was not grand by the standards of Brighton, but it was sturdy, purchased and maintained through years of relentless, honest labor that had never required the approval of the city's social elite. I moved down the hallway and stopped in front of the heavy oak door that led to my private home office. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the room smelling faintly of aging paper and polished leather. I walked directly to the massive, fireproof safe I had bolted into the concrete floor in the corner of the room when we first moved here in the 90s. I spun the combination dial with a steady hand. Left, right, left, the mechanical tumblers clicking into place with a satisfying, metallic precision. I pulled the heavy steel door open, the interior cool and dark. Inside sat the physical history of my financial existence. Stacks of legal documents, original property deeds, and a single, thick, leather-bound master ledger. I reached in and pulled out the ledger. Imprinted on the front cover in subtle, understated gold lettering were the words Bennett Holdings. I carried the weight of it to my desk and switched on the brass reading lamp. I opened the book to the most recent financial summaries, the pages covered in the neat, handwritten entries I had kept for 20 years. Lachlan and Chloe operated under the assumption that I was merely a retired builder surviving on a modest monthly government pension. They treated me with the polite, practiced disdain reserved for the elderly and the supposedly powerless. They had absolutely no idea that 10 years ago, I had successfully sold my commercial construction and equipment leasing firm for $40 million. I had placed every cent of that sale into an irrevocable, discretionary trust managed by a private firm in the city, specifically structured to ensure that no single person, least of all an arrogant, entitled heir, could dismantle the capital I had labored to preserve. I looked at the complex financial webs documented in the ledger, the dividends, the diversified portfolios, and the quiet investments. They thought they had outgrown me. They believed they were the sole architects of their own success, laboring under the delusion that their status was legitimate. They were profoundly mistaken. I closed the ledger, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet office. I was no longer merely a discarded grandfather watching from the periphery. I was the silent primary stakeholder of a legacy they had spent years trying to erase. I realized then that I was not just a spectator to their unraveling. I was the one holding the demolition blueprints. I left the ledger on the desk, stood up, and looked out the window toward the dark silhouette of the hills. The time for passive observation had ended. It was time to conduct a comprehensive audit of my son's life, and I suspected that once the surface was peeled back, there would be very little left standing. The journey from the quiet, mist-covered ridges of the Dandenong Ranges to the towering glass monoliths of Melbourne's financial district took exactly 1 hour. The morning traffic along the M1 was dense, a rhythmic pulse of commuters, but I did not mind the delay. It provided the necessary space to dismantle any lingering paternal weakness, allowing me to approach the city with the clinical detachment of a man surveying a job site. I navigated my battered utility vehicle into the subterranean parking structure of a skyscraper on Collins Street, parking with practiced precision between a luxury sedan and a high-performance sports car. I stepped out, smoothing the subtle wrinkles of my flannel shirt, and walked with measured purpose toward the private lift reserved for executive clients. The polished steel doors glided open on the 50th floor, revealing the marble-lined reception area of the city's most formidable corporate law firm. The receptionist, a young woman in a sharp, impeccably tailored suit, looked up from her dual monitors. For a fleeting second, her expression registered the expected flicker of confusion at my worn work boots and faded denim. Then, she recognized my face. She stood immediately, her posture straightening into a line of professional respect, and offered a composed greeting, addressing me clearly as Mr. Bennett. She did not inquire whether I had an appointment. She simply pressed a button on her desk phone and informed the firm's lead partner that I was ready to be seen. I walked down the long, silent corridor, passing glass-walled conference rooms where men in $1,000 suits gestured over corporate mergers. I reached the heavy oak door at the end of the hall and opened it. Stewart, the firm's senior partner, sat behind a sprawling mahogany desk overlooking the gray, sweeping expanse of the Melbourne skyline. Stewart had been my lead legal counsel for 20 years, a man who dealt exclusively in facts, precedents, and the cold, binding weight of consequences. He looked up from his paperwork, removed his wire-framed reading glasses, and gestured for me to take the seat. Opposite him, he noted, with a hint of concern, that I rarely visited the office outside of our scheduled quarterly reviews. I took the leather chair and told him that a sudden, critical shift in family dynamics required an immediate, comprehensive audit of all assets held within the Bennett Trust. Stewart's demeanor sharpened instantly. He opened his laptop, entered a secure authorization code, and leaned back, his eyes fixed on me. I kept my voice perfectly level as I explained the circumstances. The exclusion from the graduation dinner, the disparagement of my character, and the clear indication that my family's lifestyle in Brighton was no longer tethered to reality. Stewart listened without interruption, his pen poised over a legal pad. When I finished, he did not offer superficial empathy. Instead, he brought up the master file for the discretionary trust on his screen, his brow furrowing as he reviewed the recent activity. I reminded him of our agreement a decade ago. I would rather see the capital repurposed than watch it be used to fuel the arrogance of a man who had forgotten the value of the work that created it. I instructed him to run a deep, forensic investigation into Lachlan's current financial standing. I wanted to see every loan, every outstanding debt, and every desperate move they had made to maintain their facade of affluence. I had come to Collins Street not to seek comfort, but to initiate the process of holding them accountable. And as Stewart began to type, I felt the satisfying, cold certainty that the structural integrity of their world was about to be tested. Stewart worked with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a man accustomed to dismantling corporate deceptions. For nearly an hour, the only sound in the office was the rhythmic tapping of his keys and the distant, muted roar of Melbourne city traffic below. I sat in the leather chair, watching the cursor blink on his monitor, feeling the weight of the years pressing down. When he finally stopped, the silence that filled the room felt heavy and definitive. He turned the laptop around, pushing it across the smooth surface of the mahogany desk toward me. He explained that we did not need to hire a private investigator to uncover the foundation of Lachlan's life. The banking network had already flagged a series of highly irregular transactions that were directly linked to my legal identity. He pointed a steady, professional finger at the screen, directing my attention to a scanned legal document pulled from the state government's property registry. It was a commercial bridge loan application for $3 million. My breath hitched, not from panic, but from the chilling realization of the extent of their desperation. Stewart explained that traditional banking institutions would never have granted a loan of that magnitude to someone in Lachlan and Chloe's financial state. Their credit scores were battered, their income was inconsistent, and their business ventures were failing. However, the lending firm in question, a predatory commercial group known for exploiting distressed assets, had approved the loan based entirely on the collateral offered. My heart turned to ice as I read the property description. The 60 acres of land I owned in the Dandenong Ranges, the very sanctuary where I had built my workshop and spent the quietest years of my life. The staggering scale of the conspiracy settled over the room like a suffocating fog. Lachlan had not merely excluded me from a dinner. He had methodically planned to leverage my land to secure his own professional survival. Stewart explained the mechanics of the deception. Because I had diligently managed the property through the trust, it represented pure, unencumbered equity, the precise asset required to finalize a high-risk commercial deal. The realization hit me with the force of a structural collapse. My son had not just evicted his father from his own family social circle. He had willingly sacrificed my legacy on the altar of his own failure, throwing the land I had earned through 40 years of labor to a corporate shark simply to avoid the public shame of bankruptcy. I stared at the screen, tracing the digital lines of betrayal from the quiet hills of Dandenong to the boardroom of a predatory lender. I did not feel the erratic, frantic pulse of fear. I felt the cold, hard clarity of a structural engineer who has finally identified the exact defect that will cause a building to buckle. I asked Stewart how they had managed to bypass the rigorous legal requirements for transferring a property deed, a process that demanded certified, notarized verification. He pointed to the final page of the application, where an official blue notary stamp sat beside a signature. My gaze locked onto the ink. It was not a clumsy, rushed imitation. It was a flawless, terrifyingly accurate replica of my own signature. Lachlan had spent months, perhaps years, studying my hand, practicing every loop and angle until he could replicate my identity with cold, premeditated perfection. I looked at Stewart, the absolute devastation of my son's choices laid bare before us, and knew that the demolition was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. The discovery of the forged signature was not merely a legal violation. It was a psychological breach that redefined my understanding of my own son. I remained in Stewart's office, the cool air conditioning of the Collins Street high-rise doing nothing to temper the heat of the realization spreading through my chest. Stewart explained that the notary public listed on the document was a man operating out of a disreputable title loan office on the industrial fringes of Melbourne, an individual notorious for bypassing legal scrutiny in exchange for significant cash incentives. Lachlan had not simply acted in a moment of panic. He had invested time, money, and calculation into the premeditated erasure of my financial autonomy. He had sat at his desk in his expensive Brighton home, night after night, meticulously copying the specific pressure and flourish of my handwriting, turning the very skill I had taught him as a child into a weapon against my future. I reached out, my calloused index finger tracing the blue ink on the screen, noting the terrifying precision of the loops. I recalled sitting at our old kitchen table 30 years ago, guiding his small hand to teach him how to hold pen. The irony was a jagged, painful weight. I asked Stuart how we could utilize this evidence without immediately alerting them, allowing them to remain in their illusion of impending victory. I did not want a quiet, tedious settlement. I wanted them to experience the full, devastating reality of their own hubris. Stuart understood. He leaned back, steepling his fingers, and remarked that what we held was not just a case of fraud, but a federal felony that could lead to extensive custodial sentences. He suggested we initiate a controlled collapse. We would let the predatory lender proceed with the final stages of the loan approval, allowing Lachlan to believe he had successfully liquidated my property. By the time he went to celebrate the influx of capital, he would already be walking into a trap prepared by the Federal Financial Crimes Division. I felt a cold, satisfying resolve solidify within me. I was no longer a father grieving for his son. I was the principal investigator of a project I had been forced to take over. I instructed Stuart to draft the necessary affidavits and to coordinate directly with the authorities to ensure that, when the moment arrived, there would be no avenue for escape. As I left the office and walked back to my vehicle in the subterranean garage, the city lights of Melbourne seemed to sharpen, stripping away the comfort of my previous ignorance. I realized that my son had viewed my quiet, humble life as a weakness to be exploited, never once considering that a foundation built on deceit would inevitably fail under its own weight. I turned the ignition, the engine of my utility vehicle humming with a steady, reassuring power, and began the drive back to the Dandenong Ranges. The path forward was now clear. I possessed the evidence, the legal backing, and the moral certainty required to dismantle the structure of his lies. The demolition was officially underway, and for the first time since the phone call from Brighton, my mind was entirely and chillingly at peace. The following evening, I navigated my utility vehicle into the heart of the arts district in Melbourne, a starkly different landscape from the misted seclusion of the Dandenong Ranges. The narrow, pristine streets were lined with exclusive galleries and showrooms, their windows displaying the kind of unattainable luxury that Chloe had spent her entire social existence coveting. I parked my battered vehicle directly in front of the expansive, floor-to-ceiling glass storefront of Chloe Bennett Interiors. I sat in the driver's seat for a prolonged moment, the engine idling as I observed the interior. The display was a meticulously curated theater set, featuring imported velvet sofas and rare marble centerpieces that projected an aura of untouchable wealth. I knew, based on the forensic report Stuart had generated, that this studio was a hollow vessel. Every piece of high-end furniture was purchased on high-interest credit, funded by retainers stolen from clients whose projects had been abandoned months ago. I turned off the ignition and stepped onto the clean, polished pavement. I did not attempt to brush the fine wood dust from my green flannel shirt, nor did I clean the dried mud from the tread of my steel-toed boots. I pushed open the glass doors and entered the world they had fabricated. The air inside was heavy with a cloying, expensive floral perfume, designed to mask the desperation of a failing enterprise. The floor was polished to such a high, white shine that it reflected the overhead track lighting like a cold, still lake. I walked slowly past a display of bespoke textiles, my heavy boots squeaking against the pristine surface, a deliberate, grounding sound that cut through the soft, ambient jazz playing from hidden speakers. At the far end of the sprawling studio, around a custom-built quartz island, A group of 3 young design assistants was clustered in a tight, sycophantic formation around Lachlan and Chloe. They were holding court, their laughter ringing out with an artificial, practiced cadence. Lachlan was dressed in a tailored navy suit that likely cost more than a month of my pension, while Chloe wore a designer silk dress, her wrists clattering with heavy, expensive gold bracelets. They were toasting to the impending expansion, their voices filled with the supreme, reckless confidence of people who believed they had finally secured the $3 million lifeline. They were celebrating the impending foreclosure on my home as if it were a legitimate corporate milestone. I stood near the entrance, my hands resting heavily at my sides, a stark, unpolished reality in the center of their temple of vanity. The young assistants were the first to notice me. Their enthusiastic smiles vanished, replaced by looks of genuine alarm as they surveyed my work-worn appearance. Lachlan turned, his crystal flute stopping halfway to his mouth. For a heartbeat, the color drained from his face, the shock of seeing the man he had supposedly erased from his life standing in his sanctuary. Chloe turned next, her gaze scanning me from my heavy boots to my frayed collar, her expression twisting into a sneer of pure, unadulterated contempt. I had brought the reality of honest labor into their flawless illusion, and I could see the panic flickering beneath their performative arrogance. I remained perfectly still, waiting for them to acknowledge the presence they had worked so hard to exclude, knowing that the structural integrity of their facade had already begun to buckle. Lachlan was the first to bridge the distance, his footsteps rhythmic and aggressive against the polished white concrete. He stopped only inches from me, his face a mask of suppressed, frantic hostility. He kept his voice low, hissing the words through clenched teeth to ensure the design assistants remained oblivious to the nature of our exchange. He demanded to know what I was doing in his place of business, his eyes darting to my worn work boots as if they were physically contaminating his floor. He told me I looked like a vagrant, and that my presence was an insult to the professional image he had fought so hard to build. Before I could offer a response, Chloe stepped up beside him, her expression one of profound pity mixed with an icy, visceral disgust. She did not bother to lower her voice, clearly intending for her employees to witness her dismissive authority. She sighed loudly, shaking her head as if dealing with a confused, wayward child. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a $50 gift card to a chain diner located on the outskirts of the city. She held it out between 2 manicured, trembling fingers, explaining in a patronizing, slow tone that since I had missed the graduation celebration, this was their way of allowing me to treat myself to a decent meal. She stated that it was much better suited to my particular pedestrian taste than the vintage champagne and imported delicacies they had served their elite guests. I raised my hand slowly and accepted the plastic card from her grasp. Its lightness felt entirely absurd. A thin piece of plastic offered by a woman whose entire existence was currently being dismantled by the financial evidence sitting in my attorney's safe. I did not break my silence. I looked from the plastic card in my palm up to Chloe's face, observing the way her triumph masked a deep, brittle desperation. She interpreted my quiet observation as a sign of grateful submission, offering a cruel, self-satisfied smile as she took a step back to align herself with Lachlan. She remarked that I needed to understand my place in their new world, explaining that their social circle consisted of high-net-worth individuals who expected a certain standard of refinement. She insisted that my presence, my calloused hands, and my flannel shirts were a liability to the brand, a physical reminder of the life they had successfully shed. Lachlan, emboldened by his wife's monologue, pointed a rigid finger toward the heavy glass doors leading out to the arts district. He commanded me to leave, claiming they were expecting an important visit from a private equity representative who would secure their financial future indefinitely. He boasted about the empire he was constructing, mocking the decades I had spent working with my hands and claiming that I possessed neither the vision nor the ambition to navigate the modern corporate landscape. I stood perfectly still, absorbing every word of his delusional rant. I let him construct his pedestal of lies, watching him inflate his ego while, unbeknownst to him, I reached into the lining of my coat. With a steady, deliberate motion, I toggled the small, tactile slide switch on the digital voice recorder I had hidden there. I had captured every insult, every boastful fabrication, and his absolute denial of the fraud. I tucked the recorder back into my pocket, the device now holding the definitive proof of his malice. I looked at them, not with anger, but with the cold clarity of a man who had already seen the end of the project. I told Lachlan to enjoy his expensive champagne, noting that the taste of victory often turns incredibly bitter when the final bill eventually arrives. I turned and walked toward the glass doors, leaving them in the suffocating silence of their own making. The transition from the cloying, synthetic atmosphere of Chloe's interior design studio back to the clean, biting night air of the arts district was a necessary, cleansing shift. I walked with deliberate purpose toward my utility vehicle, the audio recorder in my pocket feeling like a heavy, leaden weight of truth against my ribs. I did not drive back to the quiet seclusion of the Dandenong Ranges. The work remained incomplete, and the foundation of their deceit still required one final, tactical intervention. I steered the vehicle back toward the towering glass structures of the Central Business District, arriving at the regional headquarters of Apex Financial. This institution, which had greedily sanctioned the $3 million bridge loan without performing even the most rudimentary due diligence on the collateral, occupied the top 3 floors of steel and glass skyscraper that loomed over the city like a monument to predatory finance. I parked in the visitor lot and rode the silent elevator to the executive level. The reception area was an intimidating landscape of dark walnut paneling and thick, charcoal-colored carpeting, designed to project an aura of insurmountable authority. The receptionist, a woman whose appearance mirrored the cold, detached professionalism of Chloe's design studio, looked up from her monitors with a flash of distaste at my work-worn attire. I placed both of my calloused, dust-stained hands flat on the pristine marble surface of her desk. I told her I was not there for a consultation, but to inform the regional director of commercial lending that the primary collateral listed on the loan for Chloe Bennett Interiors was irrevocably fraudulent. The effect was immediate, the veneer of corporate composure shattered. She looked at me with a mixture of confusion and profound alarm, and within 2 minutes, a man named Richard, the regional director, hurried out of his office, his face pale and eyes wide with concern. He ushered me into his private suite, the door clicking shut with a sound of heavy finality. He demanded to know who I was and the nature of my accusation. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I reached into my wallet and slid my driver's license across the desk. When he read the name that appeared on the property deed his firm had supposedly vetted, he looked up at me as if the air had been suddenly extracted from the room. I then retrieved the original master deed for my 60 acres of land in Dandenong, the heavy parchment stamped with the official state seal and the certification of the Bennett Discretionary Trust. I placed it beside my identification and commanded him to read the security clauses in the second paragraph. Richard read the dense legal text, his face draining of blood as the realization dawned that he had authorized a multi-million-dollar disbursement based on a felony. He began to stammer, reaching for his office phone to call his legal department and freeze the loan, but I stopped him with a firm, raised hand. I told him he would not cancel the loan today. He would allow the process to continue exactly as Lachlan and Chloe expected. He looked at me with incredulity, asking why I would risk my own property. I removed the digital voice recorder from my pocket and placed it on his desk. I pressed play, and the room was instantly filled with the audio of Lachlan bragging about his flawless business plan, insulting my life's work, and denying any knowledge of stolen collateral. Richard listened in stunned, horrified silence until the final word was spoken. I instructed him that they were hosting a victory dinner at one of the city's most exclusive restaurants that Friday evening. I told him to freeze their accounts at 5 o'clock, precisely 1 hour before their dinner commenced, and to prepare a certified notice of revocation for criminal fraud. I informed him that my attorney, and I would personally deliver that letter to their table. The regional director looked at the deed, the recorder, and the unwavering resolve in my eyes. He realized he was not dealing with a confused, elderly tradesman, but with a man who had meticulously engineered their total collapse. He nodded slowly, his silence signifying his complete, fearful compliance. The trap was now fully armed, and the countdown to their ruin had begun. Friday evening in Melbourne brought a sharp, biting wind that swept through the skyscraper canyons of the central business district, yet the atmosphere inside the city's most exclusive restaurant was suffocatingly warm and heavy with the scent of white truffles and aged red wine. This establishment, a fortress of culinary opulence where reservations were impossible to secure for the uninvited, served as the stage for the final act of Lachlan and Chloe's masquerade. Inside the soundproofed walls of the private executive suite, the table was draped in linen of an agonizingly pristine white, adorned with towering arrangements of rare orchids. 10 plush velvet chairs surrounded the setting, currently occupied by a collection of private equity investors and venture capitalists who remained blissfully unaware that they were dining in the presence of a federal fraud. Lachlan sat at the head of the table, his tuxedo tailored to razor-sharp precision, projecting the relaxed, casual confidence of a man who believed he had successfully leveraged $3 million of fraudulent capital to cement his status in the Melbourne elite. He swirled a glass of vintage Pinot Noir, his face flushed with the intoxicating, dangerous thrill of his perceived victory. He was convinced that the loan funds had been wired into his business accounts that afternoon, unaware that the accounts were, in reality, hermetically sealed by federal investigators. Chloe, seated beside him in a floor-length emerald silk gown, radiated an aura of artificial perfection. She leaned across the table, engaging the wives of the investors with vivid, intricate descriptions of a non-existent luxury hotel project in the city, her lies flowing with a fluency that suggested she had begun to believe them herself. The investors, hardened men and women with reputations for aggressive business instincts, were completely captivated by the theater of wealth surrounding them. They looked at the vintage wine, the sterling silver flatware, and the undeniable projection of success, assuming that no one would dare host a dinner of this magnitude unless they were already wildly successful. They were sitting at a table funded by stolen client retainers and federal perjury, consuming thousands of dollars worth of premium goods that Lachlan and Chloe had absolutely zero means of paying for. The irony was profound, yet entirely invisible to everyone in the room. They believed they were witnessing the ascent of a visionary power couple, when in fact they were sitting in a sinking ship that had already been scuttled from the inside. At exactly 7 o'clock, Lachlan stood up and tapped his crystal champagne flute with a silver fork, the ringing sound cutting through the polite hum of conversation. He thanked his guests for joining him on this momentous occasion, speaking with the conviction of a man who commanded millions of dollars on a daily basis. He declared that this dinner marked the beginning of a highly lucrative partnership that would forever change the landscape of the city's interior design and property development sectors. He invited everyone to raise their glasses to their guaranteed mutual success. The sound of crystal clinking together filled the room, marking the absolute zenith of their hubris. Outside the thick, soundproof doors, hidden in the shadows of the restaurant's foyer, I stood with Stewart and 2 senior agents from the Federal Financial Crimes Division. I did not move. I simply waited for the ringing of the glasses to fade, knowing that the structural integrity of their fabricated reality had reached its limit. The stage was perfectly set, and it was time for the truth to bring the ceiling down. The transition from the foyer into the private executive suite was marked by a sudden, violent collision between the curated illusion of success and the undeniable reality of law. I pushed the heavy oak doors open without a formal knock, and the sound of the latch clicking into place echoed like a gunshot in the silent, opulent room. We stepped inside as a cohesive unit. Stewart, with his briefcase full of incriminating affidavits, the 2 federal agents, whose presence brought a chilling, immediate gravity to the festivities, and I, an old man in a worn flannel shirt, a figure whose very presence was a testament to the life Lachlan had sought to bury. The vibrant, celebratory energy that had permeated the room only seconds before evaporated instantly, replaced by a suffocating, unnatural stillness. Lachlan stood at the head of the long, rectangular table, his crystal champagne flute still suspended in midair. For a fleeting moment, his face remained fixed in the arrogant, practiced smile of a man addressing his inferiors, but as his eyes landed on me, the mask shattered. The color drained from his skin as if he had been struck a physical blow, his brain frantically struggling to reconcile the existence of his father with the presence of federal investigators in his private sanctuary. Chloe, seated beside him, let out a sharp, involuntary gasp, the silver spoon in her hand clattering against her porcelain plate with a sound that felt like the final gavel strike. The investors around the table, men who survived in the financial world by strictly avoiding all forms of legal contagion, immediately pushed their chairs back, distancing themselves from the couple as if they were already showing symptoms of a terminal disease. Stewart stepped forward, his voice cutting through the heavy air with the unwavering, cold authority of the law. He introduced himself and the federal agents to the room, his words carrying the weight of irrevocable consequences. The reaction was a spectacle of survivalist instinct. The lead investor did not even wait for an explanation. He reached for his suit jacket, his expression one of absolute, scathing disgust, and directed the others to leave immediately, stating clearly that he would not be associated with anyone facing federal fraud charges. The room erupted into a controlled but frantic exodus, the wealthy patrons rushing toward the exit while avoiding eye contact with the couple who had just been exposed. I walked slowly down the length of the table, my boots making a deliberate, rhythmic sound against the polished floor until I reached Lachlan. I reached into the breast pocket of my jacket and pulled out the thick, embossed envelope containing the notice of loan revocation and the evidence of the forgery. I did not hand it to him politely. I dropped the heavy packet squarely into the middle of his untouched Wagyu beef. The sauce bled into the white envelope, a dark, viscous stain that seemed to mark the exact moment his life changed forever. I looked him dead in the eye, my gaze steady and devoid of pity, and told him that his $3 million lifeline had been permanently severed because the asset he had pledged was never his to give. He stood trembling, a man draped in the trappings of power, finally realizing that the ground he had been standing on had been hollow for a very long time. The grand masquerade was over. The bill had finally been presented, and I was the one who had made sure he was the only one left to pay it. The fallout from that evening at the Royal Brighton Yacht Club was absolute. A structural failure so total that not a single brick of Lachlan and Chloe's fabricated life remained standing. By Monday morning, the news of the federal fraud investigation and the public humiliation of the property development visionaries had permeated every corner of Melbourne's financial district. The studio on the Arts Corridor was shuttered, its doors locked by order of the court to preserve evidence of the embezzled client retainers. Within a week, the luxury vehicles had been repossessed from the Brighton driveway, and the primary mortgage lender had initiated foreclosure proceedings on their home, citing the fraudulent loan application as a catastrophic breach of contract. They were not merely bankrupt. They were social pariahs, their reputations incinerated by the very investors they had once desperately tried to impress. 2 weeks later, the cold, bracing wind of a Melbourne winter was whipping through the Dandenong Ranges when I heard the crunch of gravel outside my workshop. I was standing at my workbench, my hands occupied with the steady, meditative task of oiling the mahogany desk I had built for Cameron. When I looked out, I saw a battered taxi idling at the edge of my property, near the heavy iron gates. Lachlan and Chloe stepped out, appearing unrecognizable in the harsh morning light. They were gaunt, their expensive clothing replaced by wrinkled, mismatched attire, and the arrogant, polished facade they had once weaponized against me was entirely gone. They stood on the other side of the iron bars, shivering in the biting cold, their faces pale and etched with the desperation of people who had finally hit the bedrock of reality. I did not unlock the gate. I walked down the gravel driveway, my heavy work boots crunching steadily against the stones, and stopped several feet short of the iron barrier. Lachlan pressed his face against the cold metal, begging for forgiveness and pleading for access to the trust, his voice cracking with the frantic energy of a man who had lost everything. He spoke of his mistakes as if they were minor clerical errors rather than a calculated, premeditated felony designed to leave his own father homeless. I listened to him in silence, observing the way the rain washed away the final traces of his vanity. When they had exhausted their stream of excuses, I told them, with a voice that was perfectly calm and devoid of malice, that a foundation built on deceit cannot be shored up by more lies. I reminded them that I had not punished them. I had simply stopped interfering with the natural, devastating consequences of their own choices. I turned my back on them and walked away, leaving them stranded in the cold as the taxi sped back down the road, leaving the ruins of their old lives behind. The following morning, the sun rose over the Dandenong Ranges, casting a clear, sharp light across the property. I was back in a workshop when a different vehicle pulled up, a simple, reliable sedan. Cameron stepped out. He was not wearing the curated attire of his parents' world, but the sturdy, practical clothing of a young man ready to build something of his own. He walked to the gate and waited patiently, respecting the boundaries I had set. When I unlocked the gate and welcomed him in, he did not ask for money or influence. He asked only for the chance to learn how to measure, how to cut, and how to work with a standard of integrity that couldn't be bought. We spent the day together in the shop, the rhythmic sound of sanding block against oak filling the room, a steady, productive heartbeat. The rod had been cleared from the family line, and in its place, we were building something durable, something honest, and something that would finally stand the test of time.